Hello and welcome. Today let's talk Chapter 19. Chapter 19 is going to take us through the musculoskeletal system, and we'll go through first the skeleton and then we'll check out the muscles. Now when we talk skeleton, the skeleton I'd like you to know is going to provide attachment sites for our muscles. Now when our muscles contract, they're going to move our bones. The skeleton allows for walking, playing sports, and even holding a book, as we can see. Now, we'll go through when we talk more about the bones, we'll talk about some functions that are going to be specific to bones, and then we'll see when we talk muscles, once we have gone through muscles and we talked about muscles, you'll be able to understand how they work and their function then in overall movement, basically there. Now, when we talk musculoskeletal system, as we can see, it includes our bones and our muscles. Now, bones and connective tissue are going to make up the skeleton, and we'll go through and we'll look at all of that. We've already kind of seen that in the previous chapter as well. Now, muscular tissue is going to make up our muscles. So let's move forward and let's talk more about bones. Now, when we talk bones, we'll see a bone is going to be classified by its shape. Now, when we classify bones according to their shape, they can be classified either as long bones, or as short bones, flat bones, or irregular bones. Bones are going to be enclosed in a tough, fibrous connective tissue covering called the periosteum. Bone cells, we're going to start off by talking about osteocytes, one type, and then we'll look at the other two as well, are going to be found, we said, lying in lacunae. They will be found lying in lacunae. Now, when we talk long bones are going to be bones of the arms and the legs, and these bones are going to be enclosed by a periosteum, as we mentioned. And this periosteum is made of tough, fibrous connective tissue. It's going to be continuous with the ligaments. It'll be continuous with the ligaments. And we'll see it's going to contain blood vessels. It'll have openings that are going to allow blood vessels to make their way in so that way they can service our bone. Now, long bones, when you talk about their structure, we'll see their structure is going to be a little bit different compared to our short, flat, and irregular bones. Long bones will have two epiphyses, basically two bone ends, and a diaphysis. Which will be basically the shaft, the space in between the two epiphyses. So when we talk joints, they're going to form between the epiphyses of two long bones. Again, we'll look at that. We'll look at the structure of a long bone and we'll check that out there. Next in here we can see the primary connective tissues of the skeleton are going to be bone, cartilage, and dense fibrous connective tissue. As we have talked about before, all connective tissues contain cells that are separated by a matrix containing fibers, and we looked at the different fibers there as well. Bone is going to be strong because the matrix contains collagen and mineral salts. It's going to contain collagen and mineral salts. Now, when we talk bone, we talked about having two different types, right? Compact bone and spongy bone. So let's talk compact bone first, and then we'll jump into spongy bone. Compact bone is very highly organized. It's composed of osteons, we said. These are the tubular units we saw. And there we also mentioned osteocytes, our bone cells, we said, and we said they're going to be found lying in lacunae. Just like we saw with our cartilage, right? In cartilage, we saw chondrocytes, our cartilage cells in lacunae. So here we have osteocytes, our bone cells in lacunae. When we talk bone cells, we're going to see we have three different types. We're talking more in detail about bone in this chapter, so this is where we'll see it in greater detail then. Now here we can see they're saying lacunae. They mean to say lamellae. Lamellae are arranged in concentric circles around a central canal. Lamellae are arranged in concentric circles around a central canal. And here we can see our central canals we mentioned are going to contain blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. And then here we can see canaliculi are going to connect lacunae with each other and the central canal. So they're going to connect lacunae because the lacunae are going to contain these bone cells. And the canaliculi are going to allow them to get their nutrients then. Because again, you can see they're connected to the central canal where all of the blood vessels are at. And they're bringing all the nutrients in. Next time we talk spongy bone. Spongy bone is going to have an unorganized appearance. Osteocytes here are going to be found in the trabeculae. And we're going to have numerous thin plates that are going to be surrounded by unequal spaces here. Plates follow lines of stress, so spongy bone is strong. Spaces are filled with red bone marrow, we mentioned. Red bone marrow produces our blood cells. And in infants, I'd like you to know red marrow is present in cavities of basically all bones. And then when we become adults, you'll see it's going to change. It is found then in a more limited number of bones in adults. It's going to be found in a more limited number of bones when we become adults. So here you can appreciate the structure of a long bone. Here we've got one bone end, the epiphyses. Here we've got another bone end, the second epiphyses. And then between the two epiphyses, we said we have our diaphysis. So here's our diaphyses. So here's the epiphyses. Now when we talk a joint, we said this epiphyses is going to articulate then with another bone's epiphyses, and they're going to have hyaline cartilage over them. And here you can appreciate that hyaline cartilage, the articular cartilage. And the other bone is going to have the same thing on it. And then here we can appreciate the periosteum. The periosteum has been removed from the bone surface, so you can appreciate the periosteum itself. And then you can see how these openings on the periosteum then are going to allow blood vessels to make their way in and service the bone. So here we can see hyaline cartilage, and here we've got a lacuna. Inside the lacuna, we've got a cartilage cell, chondrocyte. Same thing here. We've got the lacuna. Inside the lacuna, this is the chondrocyte. Here's the chondrocyte. There's the lacuna. Okay? Lacuna, chondrocyte. And then matrix, we can see there. Here we've got compact bone. Now in compact bone, we said here's one osteon, and then here's a central canal. And then we talked about these spaces here, the lacunae. So here you can see all the lacunae, and in these lacunae we're going to have bone cells, osteocytes, all lacunae. And then we said canaliculi, these structures that look like cracks in the bone. These structures that look like cracks, they're going to be canaliculi. We said they allow lacuna to communicate with lacuna, and eventually with the central canal. So then next here we can see the lamellae. The lamellae you can see are concentric lamellae. And this is the term that they meant to put in there. And here you can see they're like the rings on a tree. When you cut a tree and you count the rings on the tree, it's the same thing as you can see right inside of here. All of these rings you have here, these are all lamellae. So we said lamellae are going to be found surrounding the central canal. And you can see all these concentric lamellae just surrounding that central canal, coming all the way around, Right? That's what we saw here. They put lacunae, but we said lamellae are arranged in concentric circles around a central canal. Lamellae. So we got osteocytes, lacunae, canaliculi, central canal, osteon. All right, let's continue forward then. So here you can see one lacuna in greater detail now. Again, same thing. You got the lacuna, and then inside the lacuna here's the cell, but in this case it's our bone cell, which is an osteocyte, we said. And then inside the cell, you can appreciate, here's the nucleus. And then we've got these canaliculi here on the outside, allowing this lacuna to communicate with another lacuna. And then here we can see everything in full-on detail now. We've got periosteum first here on the outside. It's peeled back, allowing you to appreciate the blood vessels making their way in. And there inside, the central canal, you can see of each osteon. And one osteon has been opened up for you to appreciate the lamellae. And then lacunae, all the way around, with canaliculi. And here you can see some spongy bone. which we said is going to be filled with red bone marrow. So next in here we can see we have cartilage. Cartilage is not as strong as bone, but it's more flexible. It has a gel-like matrix with many collagen and elastic fibers. And the cells we said are going to be found in lacunae. And cartilage has no blood vessels. It has no blood vessels. Cartilage, we talked 3 types: hyaline, fibro, and elastic. Hyaline is firm and somewhat flexible. It's found at the ends of our long bones. We said it's going to be found helping to make up the nose. It's found at the ends of our ribs, making up the larynx and our trachea. And then fibrocartilage is stronger. It's got thick collagen fibers that are able to withstand pressure and tension. And this cartilage is found making up our intervertebral discs and making up the wedges in between our knees. Third type is elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is the most flexible. It's got elastin fibers, we said. And it's going to be found making up our ear flaps and our epiglottis. We mentioned. Next, in dense fibrous connective tissue. When you talk dense fibrous connective tissue, if you recall, it was basically found as rows of fibroblasts that are separated by bundles of collagen fibers. And we were able to appreciate the fibroblast nuclei there as well. And when we talk dense fibrous connective tissue, it forms the flared sides of the nose. And it's also going to be helping to form ligaments and tendons. And ligaments, we said, are going to connect bone to bone, while tendons are going to connect muscle to bone. Next, then, let's move to bones of the skeleton. Now, when we talk about the bones of the skeleton, before we get into them, let's talk about the functions of the skeleton then in even further detail. So besides what we mentioned before, we can see the skeleton is also going to provide support. The skeleton supports the body. The skeleton protects soft body parts. The skeleton produces blood cells. The skeleton stores minerals and fat. And the skeleton, along with the muscles, permits flexible body movement. So the cooperation between the two permits flexible body movement. There's approximately 206 bones, and they're going to be classified based on 2 divisions of the skeleton. The bones are classified according to whether they are in the axial skeleton or whether they're going to be found as a part of the appendicular skeleton. Now, the axial skeleton, we'll see, is going to be found making up the midline of the body. And the appendicular skeleton is going to consist of the bones of the limbs and the bones of our limb girdles. So that's one classification we have there. And the other we said was based on shape. Long bones, bones of the limbs, and we talked about their shape. Next, we have our short bones. Short bones are cube-shaped bones. Examples will include bones of the digits. And we talk flat bones next. Flat bones, we can see they're going to be flat, and this will include bones such as bones of the skull. And then we have irregular shaped bones, and examples will include vertebra bones and our facial bones. And then last we have round bones like our patella. All of our bones are going to have depressions and protuberances, or processes you can say, and they're going to serve for muscle attachment. We're also going to find openings for nerves and or blood vessels. So here we can appreciate a nice image of the skeleton that depicts, first, you can see the axial skeleton right in the center, and then appended to the axial skeleton, we can appreciate the appendicular skeleton. So a nice picture. And then when we go through the bones, we'll actually be able to see the shape and go through that second classification we just mentioned. Next, then, let's go through and let's talk about the axial skeleton in greater detail. The axial skeleton, we said, is going to be found lying in the midline of the body, and it's going to consist of the bones of the skull It'll consist of the hyoid bone, the bones of the vertebral column, the bones of your rib cage, and your ossicles, the bones of the inner ear. All right, let's talk about the skull then in greater detail. Now, when we talk about the skull is going to be formed by the cranium and the facial bones. The cranium, we'll see, is going to protect the brain. In newborns, certain cranial bones are going to be joined by membranous regions called fontanelles. These fontanelles are going to allow the cranium to be compressed during birth, and also they'll allow for brain growth to occur. These fontanelles, they usually close by the age of 24 months, and they'll close by the process of intramembranous ossification. And then next we can see here, we're also going to find sinuses in relation to the skull. And these sinuses are going to be air spaces that are lined by mucous membranes. We talked about mucous membranes. And they're going to reduce the weight of the skull, and they give resonant sound to voice. Now, when we talk about the cranium, the major bones of the cranium have the same name as the lobes of the brain. So you've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Now, when we talk bones, we'll see the frontal bone is going to form the forehead. The parietal bones are going to form the sides of our brain case. And the temporal bones are going to be found below the parietal bones. And they have the external auditory canal we're going to look at in relation to them. And then we've got our occipital bone, which we'll see is going to form the base of the skull. And it will have the foramen magnum, which is going to be an opening for the passage of the spinal cord. Now let's go through and let's talk about then, so foramen magnum we've got there, it's going to be an opening in the base of the skull, basically of this occipital bone, and it's going to allow the spinal cord to connect to the brain stem. So then we've got the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone we'll see is going to form the floor of the cranium and also parts of the orbits. When we talk parts of the orbit, orbits are going to actually be constructed by a few different bones. And then we've got ethmoid bone we'll look at there too. Ethmoid bone is going to form part of the orbits you can see there, and then also our nasal septum. So let's move through and let's actually check out then our facial bones. And here when we go through and we talk our facial bones, we can see we've already mentioned just now frontal bone. We went through the parietal bones, and then we talked occipital bone. Okay, and then it's going to make its way all the way down to the bottom here. You can't see that there because the temporal bone is sitting right here. And then here we've got our sphenoid bone as well. So next time, let's actually flip the skull over so we can appreciate the bottom part and see how that occipital bone makes its way down there. So here you can see that very well. Here's the occipital bone continuing to the bottom of the skull. And here's the temporal bones also down here. Here's the sphenoid bone you can see down here as well. And then here we've got a vomer bone we'll check out. And then we've got our palatine bones, L-shaped bones. And here's the other one right on this side. And then here we've got our maxillae. So the maxillae you can see from here, and also you can see the maxillae right inside of here also. And we'll talk about the rest of these facial bones in there also when we get moving forward. So let's talk facial bones then. Talk facial bones. We're going to see the most prominent facial bones are the mandible. The mandible, we can come back here and we can see the mandible right inside of here. The maxillae, you can see right inside of there, or the maxillary bones, we can refer to them as well. And then your zygomatic bones, we can see our cheekbones. And our nasal bones. So again, the most prominent facial bones are the mandible, maxillae, zygomatic bones, and the nasal bones. Here we can appreciate the mandible or the lower jaw. And when you talk about the movement in relation to the mandible, you'll see its movement is going to permit chewing. Its movement is going to permit us to chew our food. It also forms our chin. It also forms our chin. Here you can see tooth sockets. Tooth sockets are going to be found located on the mandible and also on the two maxillae. So here you can see it on one side. And then on the other side of the skull, we'll see the other maxilla will have basically the sockets for the upper row of teeth on that side. So you can say the maxillae form the upper jaw and the anterior portion of the hard palate. And the anterior 2/3, we can say, of the hard palate. The palatine bones make up then the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate. The palatine bones are L-shaped bones, and they make up, you can see here, the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate. And also you can see the lateral aspects of the nasal cavity. And the lateral aspects of the nasal cavity, because it's an L-shaped bone. So this is one of the bones. It comes over like this, and you can see the other side is going to come up like that. And that's behind this sphenoid bone. We can't see it because it's on the other side. And same thing would happen here. You would have this part come down this way, and then the other part would be basically going that way. It's an L-shaped bone. When we talk about the maxillae, when we talk maxillae, if the maxillae don't fuse properly, so we say we have two maxillae, if they don't fuse properly, this can lead to then cleft palate and also cleft lip, where then you have a communication between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, which is not good. And then surgery will be scheduled to help repair the cleft palate and or the lip as well. So the zygomatic bones are going to be our cheekbones, you can see here. They are our cheekbones. And then our nasal bones form the bridge of the nose. We said the ethmoid bone and the vomer bone, they're going to help construct the nasal septum. The septum is going to be found helping to divide the internal nose into two cavities. Next, then we can appreciate the lacrimal bones. The lacrimal bones are going to contain an opening for the nasolacrimal canals, and the nasolacrimal canals are going to allow tears to make their way from the eyes into then the nasal cavity. Now, when we talk about the temporal bones and the frontal bone, the temporal bones and the frontal bone are going to be skull bones that contribute to the face. The frontal bone, we can see it forms the forehead, and it's going to contain what we call the supraorbital margin, where we can see the eyebrows are found located. So right underneath the eyebrows, you've got the supraorbital margin. And you can see here the frontal bone is also going to help contribute to that orbital cavity. Now when we talk nose, the nose is going to be a mixture of bones, cartilages, and connective tissues. Hyoid bone, let's talk next then. When we talk hyoid bone, the hyoid bone is not a part of the skull. It is not a part of the skull, but it is a part of the axial skeleton we described. It's the only bone in the body that does not articulate with any other bone. It's found attached to the top of the larynx. And when we talk larynx, we'll see the larynx is the voice box, and it's going to be found at the top of the trachea in the neck. This bone, the hyoid bone, we'll see is going to anchor the tongue, and it's going to serve as an attachment site for muscles. So let's look at an anterior view then of the skull. So here you can see the orbits in greater detail. And here you've got the nasal cavity, and you can appreciate the septum. And you can see how the vomer and the ethmoid bone contribute to making up that nasal septum in there. Next thing here, you can appreciate the two maxillae. And here you can see is the point of fusion. So you can see most bones, when we divide the body in half, most bones are going to be found as pairs. Not all of them, most of them. The frontal bone is one bone, two temporal bones we can see, two parietal bones we can see, one occipital bone if you recall, okay, one sphenoid bone, 2 maxillae, 2 zygomatic bones, 1 mandible. Next, then let's appreciate all these bones with the skin then in place on a picture of a real individual. So you can appreciate the main bones, the frontal bone, nasal bones would be here, zygomatic bones, cheekbones, right? Temporal bones then on the side, parietal bones up here, and here you've got mandible and then maxillae. So here then we can appreciate the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone we said is found on top of the trachea. So we look at it in greater detail. Here you can see it in full-on detail. Next then let's talk about the vertebral column. Now when we talk about the vertebral column is going to consist of 33 vertebrae. It'll consist of 33 vertebrae. I'd like you to know the vertebral column is going to have 4 normal curvatures, and these 4 normal curvatures are going to provide strength and resilience to the vertebral column. Then we have also abnormal curvatures. These abnormal curvatures include scoliosis. Scoliosis is going to be an abnormal lateral or a sideways curvature we can see. Then we have kyphosis, which we also refer to as hunchback. And then last we have lordosis, which leads to a sway back. The spinal cord passes through the vertebral canal and it gives off the spinal nerves at the intervertebral foramina. The spinous processes, they can be felt in the midline of the back. Also, you have transverse processes in relation to the vertebra. And the transverse processes are going to be found extending laterally, and they're going to serve together, these spinous processes and the lateral transverse processes. Together, they're going to serve as muscle attachment sites. Together, they will serve as muscle attachment sites. So let's talk about the different types of vertebra. Our vertebrae are going to be named according to their location on the vertebral column. First, we have our cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae are the vertebrae of the neck. The first cervical vertebra is also called the atlas, and it holds up the head. The second cervical vertebra is called the axis. These 2 bones allow us to have this yes and no motion. So specifically you can see the atlas, yes. When the atlas articulates with the skull, it allows us to move our head in this yes fashion. And then when the atlas and the axis articulate with each other, they allow for this no motion. When we talk cervical vertebra, we have a total of 7 cervical vertebra. So the first 2 are specialized, and the remaining 5 we'll see are going to look just about like one another, with a few differences. Next then we have our thoracic vertebra. So we have 12 thoracic vertebra. They're going to have long, thin spinous processes and articular facets for the attachment of ribs. So that's very important. When you go through and we check out how many ribs we have, we're going to have the same quantity of ribs we'll see. So that's one way to remember both of them. Next then we have our 5 lumbar vertebra, and they're going to have a large body and thick processes to them. Next then we're going to have our 5 sacral vertebra, and these 5 sacral vertebrae you're going to see have been fused together. They're fused together and they form the sacrum. And then last we have our coccyx, or our tailbone, and it can be made up of 3 to 5 vertebrae, and they're fused as well. And then we'll see in between the unfused vertebrae, the 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and the 5 lumbar, we're going to be able to appreciate our intervertebral discs. These intervertebral discs are found between the vertebrae. They are composed of fibrous cartilage, and they act as a padding. They help to absorb shock and prevent vertebrae from grinding and crushing against one another. These intervertebral discs, they can also herniate and rupture as they weaken with age. And what this can do is it can put pressure on the spinal cord or even on the spinal nerves. So here we can appreciate our vertebral column. We've got first our 7 cervical vertebrae. Next then we've got our 12 thoracic vertebrae. And then we've got our 5 lumbar vertebrae. And then here you can see the sacrum. And then last is the coccyx right there. And then between each of these vertebrae we said intervertebral foramina. That's going to allow the spinal nerves to make their way through. You can see those there very nicely. And then intervertebral discs. You can see in between these vertebrae here. One way to remember how many you have there, you can think breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and then dinner at 5. And here we can also appreciate then the spinous processes right back here. And then here we've got the transverse processes on the sides. And then last we can appreciate here the facets for our ribs on these thoracic vertebrae. So you can see on the body and also on the transverse processes. Next, let's talk about the rib cage. The rib cage, or the thoracic cage we can also refer to it as, is going to be composed of thoracic vertebra, the ribs, and the sternum. It is a part of the axial skeleton, as we saw before also. The rib cage is going to protect our heart and our lungs. And we'll see a fractured rib can puncture the lungs. A fractured rib can puncture the lungs. And then last we'll see here the rib cage is flexible during inspiration and expiration of breathing. Next then let's talk about ribs. We have 12 pairs of ribs and all connect to the thoracic vertebra in the back. We just saw the ribs are going to associate with the body and the transverse processes of the vertebrae. The upper 7 pairs, I'd like you to know, are going to connect directly to the sternum. The upper 7 pairs connect directly to the sternum, and they are going to be called your true ribs. And they're called your true ribs. The next 3 pairs are called the false ribs because they attach to the sternum by a common cartilage. And then the last 2 pairs, they're called floating ribs. They're called floating ribs because they do not attach to the sternum at all. Here you can see that very well. So here we've got the first 7 pairs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on one side, and then same thing on the other, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the first 7 pairs, they connect directly to the sternum themselves. And then the next 3 pairs, 8, 9, and 10, they connect to the sternum by this common cartilage we see here. And then pairs 11 and 12 are floating. Next then let's talk about the sternum. When we talk about the sternum I want you to know is also known as the breastbone. The sternum is going to be found lying in the midline of the body. It's found lying in the midline of the body. It's composed of 3 bones, the manubrium. So here we've got the manubrium, the body, and then third, the xiphoid process. The manubrium is going to articulate with the clavicles, the first rib pairs, and then the body you can see here. It's going to join the body at an angle. And the angle we can see here is at the level of the second rib. It's at the level of where the second rib is going to come into contact with the sternum. And then the body we can see here is going to have pairs 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the cartilage from 8, 9, and 10 is coming in there as well. And then last here we can appreciate our xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is going to serve as an attachment site for our diaphragm muscle. So here we can see the structure of the vertebra. This is more specifically the thoracic vertebra in greater detail. So first we've got the body, and here you can see are going to be the articular facets for the ribs, because the ribs, they're going to come in like this. Let's draw one in here. So we'll see the rib is going to kind of come in here like this. This will be like the head of the rib, and the rib's going to come around and hit here, and it'll make its way towards the front of the body, going out like that. So here, let's look at this picture, and you can see right back in here, that's what you have going on. So here you can see the rib is hitting the body, and then it hits the transverse process right back in there, and then it curves towards the front. So that's what we have going on here. And then we've got the transverse processes you can see here on the sides. And then here on the side as well. And the spinous process right down the back. And then we can also appreciate the vertebral canal here. This is where the spinal cord is going to be running then. Next then, let's talk about the appendicular skeleton. We talk appendicular skeleton, you'll see the appendicular skeleton is going to consist of the bones within our limbs plus the girdles. So we have pectoral girdle and we have a pelvic girdle. So those girdle bones plus the bones of their attached limbs. Now the girdles, we'll see, not only are they going to attach the appendicular bones to the axial skeleton, but also the pectoral girdle we can see and the upper limbs are specialized for flexibility. And then the pelvic girdle and the lower limbs are specialized for strength. All right, so let's go through first the pectoral girdle, or our shoulder girdle it's also known as. Now when we talk about the pectoral girdle, I'd like you to know each pectoral girdle, or we can say shoulder girdle, is going to consist of a scapula, or we can refer to the scapula as the shoulder blades, and a clavicle, which is also known as the collarbones. The clavicle is going to extend across the top of the thorax. It will articulate, it will join with the sternum and the acromion process of the scapula, which we'll see is going to be a bone external to the ribs in the back. The scapula also contains a finger-like projection. This finger-like projection is called the coracoid process, and it's going to serve as an attachment site for muscles of the arm and the chest. The glenoid cavity of the scapula is going to articulate with the head of the humerus, which is going to be a single long bone of the arm. This joint allows the arm to move in any direction, but it has a reduced stability and it is easily dislocated. The upper limb consists of the humerus in the arm and the radius and the ulna in the forearm. The shaft of the humerus has a tuberosity, a protuberance to it. And this is where the deltoid muscle of the shoulder attaches to. The far end of the humerus has two protuberances. Those are called the capitulum and the trochlea. So let's go through and let's appreciate all of these parts here before we move further then. So let's review from the clavicle. We've got then the scapula. And here we can see the acromion and the clavicle articulate with one another. And you can even feel that right at the edge of your shoulder. And then beneath that, you can appreciate the bent finger-like projection, the coracoid process we mentioned. And here we have the glenoid cavity that we said is going to articulate with the head of the humerus. And here we have the humerus. And then right about down here is where that protuberance is at. So we said at the far end of the humerus, we can appreciate the two protuberances. Here on the lateral end, we have the capitulum. And on the medial end, we have the trochlea and the trochlea. And you can see they will both articulate with the radius and the ulna at the elbow. They articulate with the radius and the ulna at the elbow. And then the bump we call the elbow is our olecranon process of the ulna. It's our olecranon process of the ulna. Also found in this area is the funny bone, which actually is the ulnar nerve that passes through this area. So every time we strike that area there, we have a high chance of hitting that nerve. Now in the anatomical position, the radius and the ulna are found lying parallel to each other, as we can see here in the picture. Now when the arm is turned to where the palm faces backwards, the radius then crosses over the ulna. Next then, let's move down to our wrist, and then we'll take care of our hand. So we talk about the wrist. The wrist is made up of 8 carpal bones, and you can see those forearm bones articulate with those carpal bones. And these are pebble-sized bones. And these bones then you can see articulate with the metacarpals. We have 5 metacarpals, and these metacarpals are going to help form the palm. They form the palm of our hand. And you can see on their proximal end, they articulate with the carpals. On the distal end, we can see the metacarpals. They're going to articulate with the bones of the fingers and the bones of the thumb. Let's continue forward then to the pelvic girdle and the lower limb. Now, when we talk the pelvic girdle, I'd like you to know that the pelvic girdle is going to consist of 2 heavy, large, coxal, or you can refer to them as hip bones. Coxal bones, or your hip bones, we can call them. Each coxal bone is going to be made up of 3 bones that are fused together. And those 3 bones include the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The 3 bones come together at a region that's called the acetabulum. This region right in here, the acetabulum. I believe the word is derived from the word vinegar cup from back in the days. So here you can see the acetabulum is where all 3 bones fuse together. At the acetabulum is also where you see the head of the femur, the only bone of the thigh, articulate with the coxal bone. Now when we sit on our ischium, and this can be problematic. This can lead to ulcers in paralyzed patients. So the patients who are paralyzed or immobile, their caretakers will usually move them every so often to prevent ulcers. Now the 2 pubic bones, they are joined together by a fibrocartilage disc at this pubic symphysis. So here you can see one of the coxal bones, and this part of the coxal bone is the pubis bone. So this pubis bone of this coxal bone is going to articulate with the next pubis bone of the next coxal bone. The 2 pubic bones are joined together by a fibrocartilage disc at the pubic symphysis, and that's found right here at the anterior aspect. So the other coxal bone is going to be found lying right inside of here, and its pubis bone, specifically speaking, its pubis bone is going to be here, articulating with then this other pubis bone. And they have a disc of fibrocartilage in between them. The female and the male pelvis are going to differ from one another. In the female, the pelvis cavity is much more broader, and the pelvic outlet is much wider. This will facilitate childbirth. The femur, your thigh bone, the only bone of the thigh, is the longest and strongest bone in the body. The head of the femur we saw articulates with the acetabulum. The femur has 2 large processes. Here we can appreciate the first one, the greater trochanter, And the second one is the lesser trochanter right down here. And they're both going to serve as muscle attachment sites. At the distal end, the femur has a medial and a lateral condyle. The medial and the lateral condyles are going to articulate with the tibia. This area also has the patella we can see here, or our kneecap. Next then we have our leg. The leg is made up of two bones. We have the tibia and the fibula. The fibula is the more slender bone of the leg, and it articulates with the tibia both proximally and distally. So here on the proximal end of the tibia they articulate, and on the distal end they articulate. The other bone of the leg we can see is the tibia. The other bone of the leg then we can see is the tibia. The tibia is going to be second to the femur in size and strength. After the leg then we have our ankle. The ankle is going to contain 7 tarsal bones. So the leg bones articulate with the tarsals. Then the tarsals are going to articulate with the 5 elongated metatarsals, which will then articulate with the bones of the phalanges. Kind of like what we saw with the upper limb. We went from arm, forearm, wrist, and then the hand. So here we have thigh, leg, ankle, and then you've got the foot. Next then let's move on to muscle tissue. Now when we talk muscle tissue, we recall we have 3 different types of muscle tissue we talked about: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. We're going to talk about and we're going to focus on skeletal here. Now when we talk skeletal muscle we can see makes up the greatest percentage of muscle tissue in the body. And skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. It's under voluntary control. So skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. They are covered by layers of connective tissue that we call fascia. And the fascia is going to extend beyond the muscle, we said, to help form the tendon. And then tendons are going to help attach skeletal muscle to bones, as we said before. Let's talk then about how skeletal muscles work. When we talk how skeletal muscles work, first I'd like you to know they work in pairs. Now, second, I'd like you to know muscles have an origin, which is on a stationary bone, and an insertion, which is on a bone that moves. Next, then there's some terms here I'd like to review with you guys. Here we can see we have flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation. When a skeletal muscle contracts, or flexes we can say, the insertion moves closer to the origin. For example, here they're telling us the forearm towards the arm. So let's say here if we were to get our arm, right, and we were to flex the arm. So if we have flexion, here you can see the forearm moves towards that arm. And then we have extension. Extension, it moves the part away. So basically the forearm moving away from the arm. And then abduction. Abduction is a term that describes moving a limb away from the midline of the body. So if we're standing, let's say here with our arms to our sides, and if we were to move our arms away from the sides, here we have abduction taking place. Oh, it's the exact example they're giving us here. So abduction, arms sideways, and then when we move them away from the body, we're abducting our arms. And then opposite, when we bring them back, adducting, adduction, adduction, arms back to the body. And the last we can see here is rotation. Rotation is basically a movement of a bone along its own axis. So here you can see you have rotation. The head is answering no. And then we have agonist and antagonist. Now when we talk agonist, agonistic muscles are muscles that work together to accomplish a certain task or to accomplish a certain movement. And then when we talk antagonistic muscles are going to be muscles that move opposite to the agonistic muscles. So here you can see muscles actually working in an agonistic and antagonistic fashion. Here, when we're having flexion occur, when we're bringing this forearm closer to the arm, we're flexing this arm. And at the same time, we're causing an extension on the opposite side. These muscles here on this side are behaving as agonistic muscles, while these muscles on the opposite side are behaving as antagonistic muscles. So when we move forward, here we can see we have 650 skeletal muscles in our body. Let's talk about naming our muscles, the nomenclature. I'd like you to know muscles are named based on some characteristic. One, we'll see they can be named based on size. And if we do describe muscles by size, we're going to use terms such as maximus or minimus to describe the muscles. We have a muscle called the gluteus maximus. We also have a gluteus medius and a gluteus minimus. So they're all three different sizes, and obviously their size is dictating their name there. And here we can see some of those muscles are named according to their shape, such as trapezius, latissimus, and deltoid. We can also name muscles according to the location of where they're found in the body. So here you can see we have frontalis lying on top of the frontal bone, occipitalis over the occipital bone, okay, pectoralis over the chest. And then we can also name muscles according to the direction of the muscle fibers, where we'll use terms such as rectus, which means straight. We can also name muscles according to the number of attachments, such as biceps, triceps, and so forth. And then last, by their action, where then we'll refer to them as extensor digitorum, flexor digitorum, or whatever action they're responsible for exhibiting. So here we can see the major skeletal muscles of the anterior aspect of the body, and the same thing with the posterior aspect of the body, and you'll be responsible for knowing these sets of muscles. And here you have a table that will also give you the action that you're responsible for knowing about for each of these muscles too. Next, then let's move down and let's talk about muscle fiber contraction. Let's talk about the mechanisms of muscle fiber contraction. Now, skeletal muscle tissue is striated, we've seen, and it has alternating dark and light bands that we have also already looked at. Skeletal muscle is striated, as we have seen, and it has alternating dark and light bands which are formed due to the arrangement of the myofilaments in the muscle fiber. Next, then let's talk muscle fibers. Now, we talk muscle fibers. Muscle fibers, we said, are going to be a muscle cell. So they're a cell that's going to contain the usual components whom have been given special names. So we've got some listed here. What we'll do is we'll go right to this table right inside of here, and we'll go through these different parts. You can see first we have the term sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is the term we're going to give the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber that forms the T-tubules. And then we have sarcoplasm. Sarcoplasm is a cytoplasm of a muscle fiber, and it's going to contain the usual organelles, including myofibrils. And then we have the term glycogen. Glycogen is going to be a polysaccharide that stores energy for muscle contraction. Next, we have myoglobin. Myoglobin is a red pigment that's going to store oxygen for muscle contraction. And then T-tubules we talked. T-tubules are going to be an extension of the sarcolemma. They're an extension that extends into the muscle fiber and conveys impulses to eventually cause calcium to be released so that way contraction can occur. And then we have the term endoplasmic reticulum. Well, this is sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is the smooth ER of a muscle fiber, and it's going to store calcium. Next, then we have the term myofibril. It's a bundle of myofilaments that contract. And then myofilaments are actin filaments and myosin filaments whose structure and function accounts for muscle striations and contraction. And we'll look at that in greater detail as we progress, because it's all going to come down to actin and myosin. So let's move back and let's look at all of these things. Let's actually appreciate every single one of these structures. First, here in this picture, we can see we've got whole muscle. And then what we've done here is we've zoomed down onto one muscle cell, and then we are looking at the one muscle cell in greater detail. So let's start here. We've got the whole muscle, right? Here's one whole muscle, and you can see it's attached to the bone thanks to this tendon. And this muscle then, we're going to look at it in greater detail. When we look at this muscle in greater detail, then what we could do is we can pull out a bundle of muscle fibers. Now, once we pull out a bundle of muscle fibers, we can look at them in greater detail. And when we look at them in greater detail, you can see they're made up of a whole bunch of cells. And we look at one muscle fiber, one muscle cell. Here you can see what it looks like then in greater detail. So let's look at that. That's what we see here. One muscle cell you can see has the usual organelles. First of all, we're going to be able to appreciate mitochondria, the nucleus, the smooth ER we mentioned there. Here then we can also appreciate in these muscle cells myofibrils. These are the actual contractile units. So when they contract, the whole muscle contracts. Myofibrils, as we can see, are cylindrical in shape, and they run the length of the muscle fiber. The microscope allows us to see the striations are formed by the placement of the myofilaments within the sarcomeres. So let's talk sarcomeres. So here what we'll do then is we'll grab one myofibril and we'll look at that one myofibril then in greater detail. So here we can see the one myofibril. Now let me orient you here. So here you can see you've got basically a light band and then the dark band. And then you can see it continues. So here you've got light band, dark band, light band, dark band, and then it's going to make its way all the way through. So here then we can appreciate a sarcomere. A sarcomere is going to be the region that extends between two Z lines. So here we've got a Z line, and here we have another Z line. The space in between these two Z lines is called a sarcomere. So then here you can appreciate one sarcomere, and then we'll have another one right next to it, and next to that one, and next to that one, and it'll continue all the way through just like that. Now, a sarcomere extends between two Z lines, we can say. It contains two major types of proteins. Number one is the myosin, which is going to make up our thick filaments. And the second protein is going to be our protein actin, which is going to make up our thin filaments, Here then we can appreciate our sarcomere in greater detail. So Z line, and in between the Z line we've got our actin and myosin, plus a whole bunch of other structures we're going to go through and we're going to look at. First here, let's look at the I band. The I band we can see is this light colored region. It's this light colored region that only contains actin filaments. It only contains thin filaments. And these thin filaments we can see are going to be attached to the Z line. They're anchored to the Z line. Next then we can appreciate the A band. So you have the A band running in between two I bands. So this space in here is the A band. The A band has a dark region and it has a light region to it. The dark region we can see of the A band contains overlapping thick and thin filaments. Overlapping actin and myosin filaments, you can say. And the lighter region of the A band is called the H zone. When we talk H zone has only myosin filaments, only the thick filaments we see here. The thick filaments contain protein myosin. Let's look at myosin and actin then in greater detail. So when we talk thick filaments only contain myosin. Each myosin molecule is going to be shaped like a golf club. And then the straight portion ends in a double globular head, or a cross bridge, we can say. And then cross bridges are going to occur on each side of the sarcomere, but not in the middle. And the cross bridges is taking place when these thick filaments attach to the thin filaments. Thin filaments then are primarily actin, and they consist of two intertwining actin filaments. Tropomyosin is going to be a rod-like protein, and it's going to cover the active sites on our actin. It blocks them and doesn't allow contraction to occur. And it's going to be held in place by this protein called troponin. Now, When calcium comes into the picture, calcium comes in and it binds with troponin, and that troponin then moves tropomyosin off of the binding sites, exposing the binding sites, allowing for contraction to occur. But we'll look at all of that then as we progress. So let's check out how impulses are going to travel down the sarcolemma and the T-tubule to help release the calcium and eventually get our thick and thin filaments to start contracting. So let's move forward and let's see here now. Basically, we're going to see when an action potential, okay, when a nerve impulse travels along our nerve, you can see it's going to excite the end of our nerve, which contains neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are going to get released, and those neurotransmitters are going to bind to receptors on the muscle's membrane. When these neurotransmitters bind to the receptors, what they do is they help create local electrical signals here. Those local electrical signals are created because of sodium and potassium moving across the membrane of the cell, which changes the voltage. These small impulses here are eventually going to help generate a bigger impulse, an action potential. Now we talked action potential. The action potential then is going to travel along the sarcolemma, dips down into the T-tubules, allowing calcium to be released. So here we could see skeletal muscle contraction then in its entirety. So let's look at everything then in greater detail. Now here we can see we'll start off with skeletal muscle contraction. Muscle fibers we can see are stimulated by motor neurons. A branch of an axon ends as an axon terminal. So you see that axon terminal here? This axon terminal is found lying in close proximity to the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. They're lying in close proximity, not completely on top of each other. The synaptic cleft, a small gap, is going to separate the axon terminal you see here from the sarcolemma. This whole thing we can refer to as a neuromuscular junction, right? Nerve, muscle coming together. An axon terminal is going to contain these synaptic vesicles. Those synaptic vesicles then are filled with the neurotransmitter that we call acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to get released by the synaptic vesicles, and it gets released into the synaptic cleft when the nerve is stimulated. Acetylcholine then we said diffuses across the synaptic cleft, and it's going to bind to the receptors on the sarcolemma. Now the sarcolemma generates impulses that are going to spread down the T-tubules and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, helping to release calcium. So here you can see a nice photomicrograph of a neuromuscular junction. Okay, a couple of them we can see in here. So it's the same thing you're seeing there. Now when calcium, so here you can see we've got our neurotransmitters, the acetylcholine, binding to our ligand-gated channels. So here when the ligand binds, the channels open up, allowing, you can see, impulses to be generated. Eventually those impulses are going to generate action potentials that are going to travel, we said, down the sarcolemma and into the T-tubules to help release calcium. So now when the calcium gets released, the calcium is going to flood the cell. And when it floods the cell, what is inside the cell, we said? The myofibrils, which are made up of actin and myosin. So we said the calcium, when it floods the cell, it's going to go and bind to troponin. When it binds to troponin, then the troponin is going to be able to move the tropomyosin off the binding sites of actin for myosin. And then as long as ATP is there, we'll see contraction is going to be able to occur. So let's look at then these events. So tropomyosin here we can see threads or winds around our actin filaments. And then troponin is going to be located at intervals along the filament. And we said when calcium is going to be released, it binds to troponin, which causes tropomyosin threads to shift position. So let's actually see all of that. So here we can see our thin filaments. Now in greater detail, before this is all you saw. Right, these were your thin filaments. Right in here we said. So now looking at them in greater detail, you could see troponin and tropomyosin. So troponin is a 3-polypeptide globular protein. And we describe tropomyosin as a rod-shaped protein, and you can see here how it runs about the actin core. And here you can see it's blocking all of the active sites. But once calcium comes into the picture, once calcium comes in and binds to the troponin, you can see how the troponin is going to expose those binding sites. Helps to expose the binding sites. So again now, as long as ATP is in the picture, so let's put ATP in the picture. Now here we can see we are going to require ATP for attachment and for detachment too. For attachment, we can see we've already got ATP that's been hydrolyzed, and it's charged basically the myosin up, and the myosin is ready to contract. It's not going to be able to contract unless calcium comes into the picture. So as long as calcium exposes the binding sites, then we'll see the myosin is going to be able to attach to the actin. So let's say everything has happened like we want it to occur. Calcium has come into the picture. ATP has charged up our myosin. Here you can see then cross-bridge formation occur. You can see the interaction between the myosin head and the actin filaments. And here now we can see they're going to pull. They'll pull the thin filaments towards the H zone, towards the H zone. So this will continue to happen over and over and over again until you have full-on contraction of the muscle. So now here we can see our myosin pulls on the thin filament. So pulling the thin filament towards the H zone as we described. And then what's going to happen is detachment is going to occur. But we said in order for detachment to occur, binding of ATP has to happen. So the binding of ATP is going to cause the myosin heads to return to the resting position. Now, what's going to happen if there's no ATP to cause detachment? Rigor mortis occurs. It's a condition that occurs after death, obviously, right? Because that's when we're not making any more ATP. Because you've seen the pathways to make ATP. We have to be supplying oxygen. So as long as we're supplying oxygen, ATP is going to get made. And that ATP then, we said, is going to allow us to do lots of different activities in the body. Muscle contraction, we can see as one of them. So here we can see everything. Okay? And what we'll do is we'll watch a little video on this too and kind of sum everything up. All right, then last here we can see ATP previously produced before strenuous exercise lasts only a few seconds. Muscles will acquire new ATP in 3 ways. First here we can see thanks to creatine phosphate breakdown, which is an anaerobic process. And this is the process that's used first before oxygen even enters the mitochondria. And then we have cellular respiration, which is an aerobic process. And this occurs only if oxygen is available. And then fermentation, which is also an anaerobic process. And this will happen when oxygen is not delivered to meet demands of vigorously contracting muscles. And that's where then lactic acid buildup occurs and everything is going to halt then. So last then, let's watch a video depicting to us contraction. So here on YouTube, we can type in actin and myosin, and we can watch a short video on their interaction.
Is at the basis of all skeletal movements. Skeletal muscles are composed of muscle fibers which in turn are made of repetitive functional units called sarcomeres. Each sarcomere contains many parallel overlapping thin, actin, and thick myosin filaments. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other, resulting in a shortening of the sarcomere and thus the muscle. This is known as the sliding filament theory. Cross-bridge cycling forms the molecular basis for this sliding movement. Muscle contraction is initiated when muscle fibers are stimulated by a nerve impulse and calcium ions are released. The troponin units on the actin myofilaments are bound by calcium ions. The binding displaces tropomyosin along the myofilaments, which in turn exposes the myosin binding sites. At this stage, the head of each myosin unit is bound to an ADP and a phosphate molecule remaining from the previous muscular contraction. The myosin heads release these phosphates and bind to the actin myofilaments via the newly exposed myosin binding sites. The two myofilaments glide past one another, propelled by a head-first movement of the myosin units, powered by the chemical energy stored in their heads. As the units move, they release the ADP molecules bound to their heads. The gliding motion is halted when ATP molecules bind to the myosin heads, thus severing the bonds between myosin and actin. The ATP molecules are now decomposed into ADP and phosphate, with the energy released by this reaction stored in the myosin heads, ready to be used in the next cycle of movement. The myosin heads resume their starting positions along the actin myofilament and can now begin a new sequence of actin binding. The presence of further calcium ions will trigger a new cycle.
So again, you can see that'll continue until you've got maximum contraction.